Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this latest in Landor LINKS webinar series. This is the school transport webinar series, and this one is titled Optimising the School Run, Active Travel, Safe Shared Modes and SEN. I'm delighted you're able to join us. Some brief instructions before we start. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of this. So we look forward to receiving your questions, and if you could put them into the questions panel on GoToWebinar, which typically appears in the dialogue panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Pop your questions in there and we'll run through them, and we'll try and get as many as possible answered in the Q&A session. A bit about me. I'm Martin Crawford. I'm an Associate Director at WSP UK and now a member of the Hertfordshire County Council team looking at active travel, including things like school streets. The Secretary of State has announced that schools and further education colleges across the country are going to open for all year groups from the beginning of this autumn term, which obviously has some issues given the COVID restrictions, because only a proportion of children, while only a proportion of children use public transport to get to school, continuing to let them do that, enable them to do that with limited capacity because of maintaining social distancing, will be very challenging. And many children use public transport to get to school. But the government certainly believes that there are actions that local authorities can take to ensure that children can attend school in September, including promoting active travel. And Landor's series has been very strong on that over recent weeks about how to bring about active travel. I'm very keen on that. They might do things like contracting additional coaches or reduce the demand by non-school children, adults and otherwise, for public transport so that it makes it available for school children. And there might be some other things like staggering start times. And local authorities are being asked to collaborate urgently with bus, trams, trains in their area to deliver on this sort of thing, to enable children to get to school. How can you manage traffic demand? A new campaign is about to be launched quite soon about reducing demand on public transport, so keep your eyes skinned for that. And very recently, Dr. Adrian Davis, who is Professor of Transport and Health at Edinburgh Napier, published a new report on whether school streets work, school streets being usually temporary closures of streets in and next to and around school during the school day, but particularly at start and going home times. And he was assessing whether they have an effect. And I can quote him and say, he says, school street closures look to be a win-win for residents, schools and children and their families. So I think we might hear a little bit about that. Enough from me, and I'd like to introduce our fine speakers. So we have Tanya Braun from Living Streets. We have Fiona Blackley from Sustrans. I'll leave them to introduce themselves in detail. We have Adrian Weissenbrook from Wiltshire County Council, and we have Liz Davidson from Q Routes, who I'm glad to say are our sponsors for this webinar. So Mark, if you could progress the slides, please, and we'll move on to Tanya, please. And Tanya, if you could put it in, thank you.
Hello everyone, my name's Tanya Braun and I'm Head of Policy and Communications at Living Streets. A bit about us. So we are the charity for everyday walking. Our mission is to improve the walking environment and inspire people to walk more. So we have a 90-year history. We set up in 1929 as the Pedestrians Association then. And we have successes which include lobbying the government to install zebra crossings, urban speed limits, and the driving test. But today we work with communities to encourage more everyday walking. So we work with schools, workplaces and community groups across the country, and we witness great results in our projects. Alongside that, we campaign for more investment in walking and to prevent barriers to walking. So things like our pavement parking campaign is a key one there. So next slide, please. Our Walk to School campaign is over 20 years old and began with our renowned Walk to School week, which is normally held in May, but due to coronavirus will be on the first week of October this year. But in more recent years, we've established WOW, our year-round Walk to School challenge, which runs in primary schools across the UK. So we work in just over 2,000 primary schools with WOW to encourage more young children to walk to school. So WOW is a badge reward scheme, which is enjoyed by pupils, parents, carers and teachers alike, and we witness real change through the challenge. So on average, in WOW schools, we see a 23% increase in children walking to school, and that has a corresponding 30% drop in cars driving up to the school gates. We also run our Little Feet initiative, and that's in early year settings, and next steps to secondary school in secondary schools. We recognise there are unique challenges and motivations for walking and travelling actively to school, and have adapted programmes which support each type of school setting. Next slide, please. So data released by the government last week in their annual travel survey shows fewer children in England are walking to primary school. In 2019, 47% walked, compared with 51% the year before and 53% in 2018. Alongside this, we know children aren't achieving the right amount of physical activity, and this is contributing to children leaving primary school either overweight or obese. And this isn't all. 28% of our domestic carbon emissions come from transport, and with 1 in 4 cars in the morning peak on the school run, school transport is a great way to reduce at least some of these emissions. The number of cars on the road outside schools is bad for our children's lung health. In fact, 2.6 million children are in schools where fine particles in the air exceed WHO's recommended limit for air pollution. Basically, the current school run situation isn't helping our children grow healthily. It's important to note that 20% of those who live within a mile of the primary school don't walk at the moment, and these are the journeys that are living streets we're particularly keen to explore and encourage to be walked, cycled or scooted. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 adds to the need for action and highlights the need for other changes. For example, poor air quality has been highlighted for further complicating COVID-19 symptoms. The need for social distancing has placed big constraints on public transport capacity, and it's vital parents don't respond by jumping in their cars for school transport. The government's responded positively, providing additional funding to support coach and bus travel to school, in addition to the funding made available for walking and cycling. The £40 million investment in school transport announced by the Education Secretary and the Transport Secretary at the weekend is welcome and will positively support the education restart. And this sits alongside the £2 billion investment already made by the DfT in walking and cycling, which came earlier this year. This presents a real opportunity to use the current positivity around walking and cycling to change the school run into a school walk, scoot or cycle. We must use this current positivity around these modes to change the school run into a school walk or cycle. But it's important that we also think about how we can create additional space around schools to ensure the school walk is safe from a COVID secure perspective, and to reduce the number of vehicles around our schools to improve wider road safety and air quality. Next slide, please. Walking to school is free, easy and accessible. We can use our streets to travel short distances, whether that's on foot, in a wheelchair or using another mobility aid. That being said, we definitely need good walking infrastructure and motivation to change our current behaviours and opt for walking as the main mode of school travel. Through our WOW Challenge, Walk to and Walk to School outreach programmes, we are witnessing change across the country. How good would it be if every school could have access to our WOW Challenge, which has real impact? These programmes would add much benefit to any school, but in conjunction with school streets, low traffic neighbourhoods and slower speed limits, they could have a really profound and long-lasting effect. Next slide, please. So investment in street infrastructure schemes like school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods will help create an attractive and walking environment. Investment in active travel behaviour change schemes like WOW will help embed a change in travel choice. Together, they can change the school run into a school walk. The £2 billion fund for walking and cycling announced by the government is a really positive step to boosting the uptake of these methods to travel to school. And the final slide, please, is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, very much for that. Before we move on, perhaps I could remind everyone about the Q&A session we've got at the end of this, end of our talks. If you could use the questions box, which is in the GoToWebinar panel, which should be at the right of your screen normally. Submit a question there and I'll be putting those to our presenters in the session at the end. So if we can now move on to Fiona Blackley at Sustrans. Fiona, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about school streets project specifically. Both Martin and Tanya have already mentioned them, and I'm going to work on the basis that everybody broadly knows what a school street is. But as Martin sort of roughly alluded, it's particularly about the street environment outside of the school gates, and it's most ordinarily is around timed closures for a short section of the street, normally at drop off in the morning and pick up in the afternoon times, and it can be enforced in a variety of different ways. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about the few things that are really important in how to deliver school streets. Sustrans been working on school streets projects for a few years now. They're still a relatively new thing, but they are definitely building pace, particularly in our main urban areas, London and the other big cities. One of the most important things, this applies to school streets, but any other kind of active travel intervention, and even to the kind of campaigns that Tanya was just talking about. It's really important that that people officers working on this in local authorities across the country make sure that they have good political support behind them. All kinds of changes to the street environment can be very provocative and create a great deal of noise from local residents. So it's really important that you have strong leadership by the decision makers behind you, and that they fully know and understand the schemes that you're designing and implementing, and that they will support them and help promote them, and won't buckle under any negative pressure that will inevitably come, particularly at the very beginning of an implementation. Next slide, please. So the first thing I would recommend when looking at school streets for a local authority area is to prioritise the schools. It's impossible to do all schools at the same time, and therefore it's important to develop a sort of a basic prioritisation matrix that assesses the schools within the area and prioritises them either based on need. It can include factors such as local disadvantage. It can include things like previous stars involvement, how supportive the school already is in active travel measures. For example, whether it does have a WOW campaign, or it has, for example, Sustrans run a bike it project. So it could be something along those lines. It could be that there's particularly poor health in the local area. It could be that there's a low traffic neighbourhood being installed in the surrounding area, and having a school street would complement that. There's a whole range of different characteristics that you can assess based on, but it's really important to get that prioritisation right in the first place, so that you can start with a group of between 5, 10, 20 schools rather than trying to do them all at once. Next slide, please. Once you've identified the schools, the next most important thing is to work with those schools to understand what the problems are that they particularly face. It can be massively variable, and school streets aren't just a single one solution that can be applied exactly the same across every different school scenario. Each school's circumstance and setting is very different, and they have different problems. There's often common things like pavement parking, fly parking by parents just stopping on the street, but it can include things like particular air quality problems, a lack of a crossing at a particular junction nearby. So it's really important that you speak to the school community, including head teachers, support staff, other teachers, parents, the children themselves, to understand what are the particular problems that each school has. Next slide, please. It's also really important to get to know the kids in a school, know who it is you're designing for, get to know their names and how they currently get to school, whether they already use active modes, and how far away they live, how practical is it for them to get to school. It's also really important to understand the street environment from their perspective. For example, in that picture on the right-hand side, those kids' heads in reality are actually below the level of that guard railing behind them. So it's important to understand what the street environment looks like from a child's perspective. Next slide, please. In the short term right now, in the COVID-19 response phase that most people are in at the moment, it's possible to keep things relatively simple. It doesn't have to have big, major, costly infrastructure changes. Sometimes a school street or making it a safe route to school can be something as simple as blocking motor vehicle traffic with a planter, or a banner and some bollards as shown on the left. So it doesn't have to be high tech in the first instance. Next slide, please. But in the longer term, it's also important that we're ambitious and that we think about what the enforcement of any school streets measures look like, whether they're enforced by physical measures such as bollards and planters and barriers in the street. This is one that we did. We did the work and design work on it for a local area last year, and it's just been implemented as part of the COVID-19 response. This is actually part of a low traffic neighbourhood, but a lot of the initial work for that was done through the school, and a particular area of concern for a lot of people in the local area was about the traffic going past the school and the road safety and road danger aspects of that in particular. So it's really important that we're ambitious with what we want to achieve. Next slide, please. It's also important that we're quite creative. Obviously, these aren't photographs of school streets, but they demonstrate some of the aspects that are really important when thinking about school streets. So colour, fun, having some seating, shade, greenery, planting, all those kind of aspects can be incorporated into school streets. And it's really important that we have those in the back of our minds when we're designing any infrastructure changes to the street environment. Next slide, please. Another tip is engage as deeply as possible. It might not be possible right now to do what we've always done, to do community engagement and co-design and consultation in the way we have done in the past. But even if things are being implemented right now under experimental traffic orders, it can still be really important that you let people know what's happening. You give them advance warning of what to expect in the street. This applies to the local residents, but also to any parents, teachers, the children coming to school, so they know what to expect and what's coming their way. And then as part of the traffic order process, the consultation can happen, and it's important to get through as many different channels and communication methods as you possibly can to engage as wide a proportion of the population as possible, so that they really understand what the scheme is about and what benefits you're achieving. Next slide, please. Tanya slightly alluded to these kind of things, but the supporting tools, it's not just about infrastructure changes on the street. It's really important to have to do the support work and behaviour change activities as well. So for example, developing actual materials that show walking routes to the schools from certain areas, particularly if you've got major barriers, like you can see the major highways here. Where are the routes to cross those kind of barriers? Where are the underpasses, overpasses, safe crossings, and what are the main approach routes to the school? Can really help people to plan their routes. It may well be something in the last few months that people have got to know their local area better and have discovered new routes and new cut-throughs that they can walk or cycle or scoot. But these kind of materials can really help for people that aren't familiar with using active travel modes for the school run. Next slide, please. As well as materials, it's really important to do support activities. So during school term times, we run an awful lot of different activities with school children. We run assemblies, we take kids out onto the street directly outside their school to get them to do surveys to understand what they're looking at. We can get them to do happy and sad faces about how they feel in a certain environment. You effectively turn them into little mini urban designers. And by helping them to understand what the changes are that are coming to them, the PESTA power for them and their parents can be incredibly powerful for changing journeys to active travel modes. Next slide, please. So as well as support activities in the school in terms of lessons and those kinds of things, it's also important that they're supported with particularly skills training. It's for a lot of people and communities across the UK in urban areas, they maybe don't have back gardens where the kids can learn to ride their bikes. It's often not common for kids to get bikes. And so learning to ride a bike is not necessarily something that happens to everybody and for everybody. So running these kind of activities, particularly in areas where learning to ride isn't a common thing, and it applies to cycling and scooting as well. You can run scooter sessions and balance bike sessions for the really young kids. The training to enable them to make these journeys actively, particularly if they live a little bit further away. A lot of children in the immediate vicinity can walk to school. If they live a little bit further away, cycling or scooting can be a more attractive option to get them a little bit further. Next slide, please. And remember, it's not just about training for the kids. Again, it may well be that people haven't learned to ride a bike growing up. So training for the parents, whoever it is within the family that does the school run, whether it's parents, grandparents or other carers, it's important to upskill them and give them the tools to enable them to have active travel journeys as part of their daily lives as well. Next slide, please. And finally, remember, if you're implementing any kind of street-based changes under experimental traffic orders, that these are effectively trials. It's a great opportunity to implement things on a trial basis and test them and find out what the community thinks, what works, and what works for parents, what works for the teachers, what works for the schools, the support services, what works for parents, what works for kids, and do a multitude of different engagement methods to try and understand exactly what things are working and what isn't, and it gives you the flexibility to be able to dynamically change things as they're going along. And so it's a really important aspect of what's going on at the moment is that these are trials, and we can view them as tests, and often that helps in a lot of ways in helping get both the schools and the communities on board with these kinds of schemes. Thank you. I think that's my final slide. Great.
Thank you, Fiona, very much. It seems like you've put forward a whole load of very, very energetic and engaging ideas to get people to travel differently to school. Adrian Weissenbrook is going to talk to us now. Adrian, I'm really interested to hear what SEND means. I confess to a little bit of ignorance there. I'm sure you'll tell us. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Please take it away.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Adrian Weissenbrook. I'm the Special Educational Needs and Disability Transport Manager for Wiltshire Council, as well as the Passenger Assistant Manager as well. So today I'm going to discuss SEN transport, the additional challenges of COVID-19 and future strategy, and how that sort of links into some of the themes that we've been discussing today. Next slide, please. So Wiltshire is a case study. We are predicting to spend 12.5 million on SEN transport in the 2021 financial year, and that's compared to 7.5 million on mainstream transport. And I think what that sort of shows is how far SEN transport has come and become a budget pressure, in particular in comparison to mainstream transport, which used to completely dwarf the spend on SEND transport. But where we are now seeing a huge rise year on year for SEN transport and pupils that are accessing the service. So we're currently supporting 1,300 students, and that seems to be going up roughly by about 100 students year on year, with a particular sort of rise when the legislation changed and it went from my plans to educational health and care plans, which made access to the services a lot more readily available. We also directly employ nearly 300 passenger assistants, which sort of support these students on their journeys, some of which have to carry out medical care. And that is an increasing pressure, but both in sort of ability to recruit because it's shorter hours, and the sort of support that we're asking these passenger assistants to provide. We are predicting continued growth with an extra potential 20% additional spend in 21-22, and as well as the increase in student numbers that we're continuing to see to rise, we're obviously seeing pressures in our marketplace as well, where our transport operators are struggling to expand at the same rate because of challenges that they're facing. Next slide, please. So the challenges of SEN transport, and this is across the board, and this is pre-COVID. So we have a limited number of operators, as well as mainstream with the mainstream bus companies, on SEND transport where we use smaller operators, the taxi operators in particular, but specifically specialist minibuses, which are very expensive to purchase. They need to have a much higher spec with tracked vehicles, so they're very specialist vehicles. The increased number of students, which we are sort of struggling to sort of find placements for because of lack of local specialist provision, which hasn't been able to increase at the same rate. Whilst there are big pushes to sort of support local schools to be able to retain SEND pupils and support them in their local environment, that's not always possible. And where we are seeing that increase, we are being asked to sort of transport students further and further away, which is leading to longer journey times, which has a huge impact on the students, which leads to the high demands of the parents, who are looking to keep the journey times as minimal as possible, whilst balancing out the fact that we have a very limited resource available to us, and we have to make sure that these journeys are efficient and with sort of sharing transport with other students, which is a big challenge we all face. And the high demands of schools. So schools, by supporting parents, have put us under a lot of pressure to give the students as much support as can be possibly achieved, although we have to balance that, of course, against the limited resource we have. And we're seeing an increased need, sort of need levels of the students that we're having, with sort of advances medically, where students are, some of our children are luckily enough, and it's great to sort of survive some sort of difficult early starts, but the ongoing support that then that requires is obviously a huge demand on the service, and we have to sort of learn and grow with that. And also difficulty recruiting suitable passenger assistants. These are sort of very low sort of hour contracts, just a couple of hours start and end of the day to match the school times, which is very difficult sort of hour base to attract sort of suitable candidates. So the age profile of our passenger assistants may increase as a result, sort of those that are sort of looking to sort of wind down later in their careers, which provides other challenges as well. Next slide, please. So if you don't know, that's what COVID-19 looks like, apparently. I'm sure you've seen that on the news a lot. So we've had additional challenges, of course, due to COVID-19 in the short term and in the long term. And in the short term, whilst we've been able to provide additional resource where most of our resource hasn't been in use and been able to reutilize it in other ways, we do now have ongoing challenges. main challenge of which is even higher demands from the parents. So there's a big push for individual transport because parents are reluctant for their children to share because of concerns about lack of social distancing. High demands from schools, so where they've been encouraged by the government to vary their hours and create these student bubbles. That's not particularly practical for transport to be able to support because of the additional resource and the financial element of being able to provide such a service. We've also had a lot of passenger assistants resign because of the higher age profile of the passenger assistants we typically employ. We've had a lot that have just sort of said this isn't for them. The risks are now sort of higher, and there's been a lot of sort of passenger assistants and drivers for the same reasons, sort of reevaluating sort of what they want to do and sort of take themselves out of what they see as a riskier area. And there's also, from our soft market research, speaking with our operators, they're seeing that they're struggling to recruit drivers across the board because there's an increase in demand for drivers. One of the sort of main sort of things we've seen is sort of how we've changed our sort of behaviour throughout the lockdown period is that there's more goods and food and other sort of services being sort of ordered online and delivered. So as a result, there's a high requirement for drivers. There's a sort of large demand for that, and that's then sort of to an extent a competitor of ours. And the financial pressures that we are now under, all local authorities have taken a huge financial sort of impact in the response to COVID-19, and as part of balancing the books, there's huge pressures now to make sure that we are running a transport network that is as efficient as possible and deliver savings where we can. Next slide, please. So as part of our SEN transport strategy, sort of looking at the short term and long term, so there is the opportunity to offer personal transport budgets. This is mainly the benefit for this is where we've got solo occupancy transport, and you have a parent that may still be very nervous with sort of sharing with a driver and a passenger assistant. There is that opportunity to encourage the parent to provide their own transport in exchange for a personal transport budget, which takes, for us, there's a big saving as well as the financial. It's having that entire vehicle and passenger assistant sort of back into the network that we can use sort of other areas to sort of cope with the demand. One of the big feedbacks we're getting is that a lot of the schools and families are pushing for for as much consistency as possible, and sort of trying to get things back to normal, or whatever normal looks like again. And so we won't be doing any sort of major tendering of our pre-16 transport contracts, instead delaying those that had expired July 2020 until Easter 2021. But that also fits in with our planned use of routing software, which I'll come to later. But we have to continue our post-16 strategy as normal, because that is a change every year with significant changes to what students are on which courses. And we will see that significantly this year, where we will have students very much considering a wider range of options, we believe, for what they want for post-16 education, in which case we will sort of book things on one-off bookings until about mid-September, when we've got a settled cohort, and then procure one-year contracts. So long term, it's looking at a major review, sort of looking at sort of the reaction of the students and families, and being able to retender what we then know is what we are needing to provide long term. Increased use of routing software and making tougher decisions, which we are required to do now. We are under huge financial pressures, and we need to challenge where resource isn't being used effectively. And we also must use this as an opportunity to change the mindset of what home to school transport should look like. This is a great opportunity for us to encourage parents to have a greater involvement in their children's journey to school. So this can be promoting of walking, cycling and scootering, which is increasingly popular, and public transport when families feel more comfortable to do so. Next slide, please. So route optimization has got to be a very strong part of achieving our efficiencies and savings and getting the most out of our limited network to cope with the increasing demand. So for the pre-16 students, so it's route planning. So for changes that occur over Easter, where there's less students moving and changing schools, which tends to happen over the summer, ready for September. When we design a route and we use our routing software, which we use, of course, QRoutes, who are sponsoring today's event, we are doing a direct like-for-like comparison. So we can see a direct saving of what we're looking to achieve. And critically, when we go out to tender, there's no, once we've tendered something, that is what we are getting, and that's how it will look. The concern being, and what we've experienced when we've tried doing tendering in the summer months, is that late additional students being added to contracts causes contract price variations, and you're kind of at the mercy really of a lot of operators. So it's sort of keeping that as rigid as possible when we're doing full tendering. And post-16 transport as well. So route planning in September, sort of midway through, once the timetables are set for our post-16 students, which is something we do every year now. We will then go out mid-September and be able to completely sort of route every single post-16 establishment, which of course there's less of, so it's easier to do. And really make sure that it's making sure that you get the benefit and really follow through with and being able to follow through with what you plan through your routing. Next slide, please. That's it for me. I believe the question and answers is for the end of this, but if you'd like to email me, I'm sure this slide will be available. And whilst it is a very busy period for us planning for September, I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much for listening.
Adrian, thank you very much. That was really interesting. And a couple of very nice segues there. So Juliana, I wonder if you could confirm towards the end, after Liz's talk, what material will be made available to participants in this webinar, particularly web links and such like that have been mentioned. Before Liz talks, just remind you that if you'd like to ask some questions, we'd be delighted to hear from you. And the way to ask a question is to use the questions box on GoToWebinar, which is part of the dialogue panel that will have popped up on your screen. We've had a number of questions already, so we'll aim to crack through those after Liz's talk. Some very interesting questions being asked. So I'm going to hand over now to Liz Davidson, Chief Marketing Officer at QRoutes, who are kindly sponsoring this event. And Adrian gave us a little hint earlier about what QRoutes is all about, but I don't really know, so I'm interested to hear. Liz, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So for those of you who don't know, QRoutes is a route optimization engine. It is particularly good at home to school transport, and we find that our customers generally save 10 to 15% on their contracts compared to using other solutions. The benefits can often be wider than that as well. A reduction in the number of children that are spending extended times on vehicles, and just the confidence and clarity that the planners have. So this is a very uncertain time for planners, and we pride ourselves on our customer care, and this is a little bit about the landscape as we see it and what we're doing to try and support planners at the moment. So next slide, please. So a little bit back to basics. Although the setup of schools has changed a lot over the last 10 to 15 years with lots of academies, the responsibility for home to school transport still lies with local authorities. And they have to promote the use of sustainable travel and transport where it's possible, and make transport arrangements for all eligible children. Eligible children are normally all of those with special educational needs and disabilities, and those who live more than 3 miles from their school, or 2 miles if it's a primary school, although there's lots of ifs and buts that fall within that. The local authorities also have an interest in ensuring that the return to school or college does not overly cause wider problems such as congestion, contribute to pollution, or pose a public health risk such as accidents. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 and everything that's going on, some of the possible measures that are being explored at the moment are travelling in bubbles, travelling on socially distanced fleets, multiple runs, so having different children arrive at different times throughout the day to enable social distancing at school, but also on vehicles. Safe school streets that our previous speakers have spoken about, and using temporary stops as part of that, and temporary walking routes. Next slide, please. But a lot of these have cost implication, and there's this particular news story that I came across where one school was saying that it's going to cost an additional £20 a day per child to get these children in. Next slide, please. So we, as part of our efforts to support our local authority planners, held a webinar a couple of months ago, actually, in which we asked, our opening gambit was, how are you feeling? How have you found the lockdown so far, and how are you coping? And then it was crazy, challenging, frustrating and frenzied. And I suspect it still is all of those things to some lesser or greater degree. Now, as a software provider, we don't have all the answers, but just to some of the broader problems, but we can help our planners get answers to the questions that we can help them with. And we've been working to do that quite a bit. So next slide, please. And one of the things that we've been able to do is set up a quick solution for bubbles. So this enables limited social mixing on vehicles and facilitates track and trace. And our planners can now assign passengers to different groups and still optimize those solutions quickly as they would normally. And we're talking about getting solutions within a question of minutes. Next slide, please. Easily set up school streets and temporary stops. Closing, when my children were at primary school, and the traffic around the primary school was could be very bad at times. I think school streets are a great idea, but when you've got people travelling towards the school who are driving, that has implications for dropping off minibuses or buses. So within the software, you can close streets off when you're making a plan, and you can set up temporary stops as easily as dropping a pin, and use Street View to inspect those stops as well. Next slide, please. Rapid fleet setup. So in the case where you might be looking at social distance fleets, or where you're looking at using vehicles that you wouldn't normally use, we can set those up again quickly within the software, and planners can test the implications. If we use a socially distant fleet, how many routes will our demand cause? And if we don't use a socially distanced fleet, what's the comparison? So that the planners can then go to the decision makers and say, if you do this, it's going to cost that, and if you do this, it's going to cost that. Next slide, please. And then we've just also launched a new tool which enables the batch processing of distance-based eligibility for transport. As I mentioned earlier, people who live more than 3 miles, typically, as a very broad brush, are entitled to free transport for school. But lots of planners that we speak to have been doing this task one by one using a free tool that everyone knows the name of. This tool uses the OS network, the paths network, which is more comprehensive of the walking network. It batch processes requests, or you can do it by API automatically, and local authorities can set up or exclude sections of the path network that they deem unsafe, for example, an unlit path. Next slide, please. So it's been a very difficult time for everyone, and clearly planners are facing a difficult situation with the uncertainty and some of the things that Adrian pointed out, the demands on finding suitable drivers, vehicles. We had one planner that we were speaking to last week who was joking about that she was going to go off and start knitting buses. We can't help with knitting buses, but we can help where we can. And as part of our COVID response, we were offering free access to the software for local authorities who came to us asking for help with emergency response. So we adapted it so that it could be used for food deliveries. We're currently offering weekly surgeries for users, so a sort of drop-in session where we run through an element of functionality and then answer any questions, or they can have a discussion about how their particular authority is tackling things. And we're also offering a competitive planning as a service package to local authorities who might not want to commit to being our full customer, but say, we've got a short-term problem, we need some support. So and we like to think that our customers like us. I mean, most people do like to think that, but this particular quote was one that we liked, was not all suppliers are created equal. So that's it from me, and I'll hand over back to Martin for the discussion.
Thank you, Liz. That was really interesting. And if the other panelists could all turn their videos on so that everyone can see them, that would be great. Apologies if there's a little bit of sound from outside here. So Fiona, I'd like to put a couple of questions in your direction that have been raised in a second, so just your G'd up for those. One which I think you can probably answer pretty quickly, especially in the light of Adrian Davies's report, is, do school streets just move the problem outside the school street? That's one of them. So perhaps you can answer that while I'm finding the next question.
Finding the other one, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that is of the biggest concern, and obviously it's the case where you do any kind of intervention on a street is what are the knock-on impacts of that, and it's really important that school streets aren't, as I've mentioned, that they're not a one singular thing. They're a huge multitude of measures, and they all have to be designed specifically for the school, and because those impacts will also be different. So in some places it might be that you are displacing traffic to other places, particularly if that's through traffic. But obviously having school streets can reduce through traffic, particularly if it's part of a wider low traffic neighbourhood. But as Martin just mentioned, there's some research that's been carried out partly by Sustrans, but led by Adrian Davies, and that's available online if you want to have a look at it, or we can supply the links afterwards. It was published last week, and it's been a review of school streets across the UK and a couple of international examples as well. And the evidence, they looked at the broad impacts, the motivations for doing school streets in the first place, and what those impacts were. And the findings are that there is very little displacement of any of the problems and impacts and moving the traffic elsewhere, but in a great part because actually school streets do encourage people to walk and cycle, because the street environment becomes so much more pleasant to walk, cycle, scoot. Everyone feels so much safer. So actually an awful lot of the trips are genuinely switched from one mode to another. If they're designed really well, you can include all aspects of the school travel. So you can do things like put in temporary stops for buses. A lot of schools have multiple different entrances, so you can look at different entrance gates and how you allocate those. I've got a particular school I'm working with at the moment in the SEN buses come to a particular entrances, and everybody, they have a particular access to the school, especially for them. So the buses are well out of the way of everybody else who's arriving on foot and cycle and scooters. So you can separate by mode to help address some of the safety concerns. But like I say, the evidence is that no, and that research was funded by the Road Safety Trust specifically to look at those concerns that are often raised, understandably.
I think that's really encouraging that's such a positive finding. Can I put another question to you from Sam Lee, and perhaps everyone else who'd like to answer could answer, and that is, what is the biggest barrier to increasing the adoption of school transport with parents that are currently driving to school? So what's the biggest barrier to increasing adoption of school transport with parents that are currently driving to school? Is that something you'd like to make a start on, Fiona?
I would say it varies depending on the location, particularly in rural areas, in semi-rural, sort of market town, hinterlands, those kind of areas. I would say that distance is the biggest barrier, certainly to active travel, and having those safe routes. In urban areas, I would say the biggest barrier is probably the slide that I started with, actually, and that's having the political will and the guts to go for infrastructure changes like school streets, like low traffic neighbourhoods. That's definitely changing, but it's still only the really big cities that are are making changes in a really big way. I'm sure it will spread, and towns and cities across the UK will start to catch up. And because there is inevitable, I think I described it as noise earlier, there is inevitable backlash, particularly when schools go, school streets and those kinds of interventions are initially implemented. But another thing that comes up out of the research that, that Adrian published last week is that actually after the trial period, not only the school community feel the benefits and are supportive of school streets, but actually the local community are as well. So the residents on those streets actually find it's a far more pleasant place for them to live as well. So as Adrian said, it can be a win-win. It genuinely can be.
Thank you very much. Anyone else like to comment on that? Adrian, do you find something similar from your rather more specialist perspective? Or is it not so much an issue with SEND?
No, I mean with special educational needs, it's the parents, because of the much longer journey times, parents aren't able to fit that in as part of their working life either. In some cases, it is in our benefit for the parents to take their own children to school, but it's not a challenge for us as far as our mainstream provisions concerned. We are a very rural county, so there's sort of concerns with sort of lack of parking around the smaller village areas, which might encourage parents to use other alternative methods. But it's, yeah, I'd say distance is a big impact as well.
And on that subject, thank you. On that subject of school streets, Sarah Riles asked a question, which is: are we likely, as we're likely to be reacting quickly to COVID-created conditions, which parts of school streets would be recommended as a minimum that could be implemented quickly? So, as we're likely to be reacting quickly to COVID-created conditions, which parts of school streets would be recommended as a minimum that could be implemented quickly? I know there are a number of different sorts of measures. I mean, Sarah, Fiona, is that something you would care to comment on a bit? You're on mute at the moment, I think.
Yep, classic. That's somebody had to do it the first time. So yes, I mean that's something I've done whole presentations over the summer on what kind of sort of temporary quick win school streets can look like. But very briefly, I think that doing the prioritization is super important to start with, because understanding that we can't do all the schools in the UK at once, it's just not possible. And that if you want to deliver successful schemes, it's much better to do 10 at a time and do them really well and then move on to another 10 than to create a bit of a mess in the first 10 and then not having to go back and change them and all those kinds of things. So it's much better to do that kind of prioritization in the first place, get the backing of the local councillors, and then move forward with a handful at a time. I think in terms of the particular measures that can be used, particularly things like planters, they can be static or they can be movable, scissor barriers, those kind of banners and bollards, they can be used. There's in London, we would typically use ANPR cameras for enforcement, but they're not used elsewhere in England for legislation reasons, but equally they're not something that can just be magicked out of thin air, and they take quite a lot of technical wiring and everything to go in the background. So if we've got a few boroughs who already had them on pre-order and they're still ploughing ahead with their plans, but a lot of the other boroughs where they've not had those already on order, they're not able to implement those for September. I would say that it's really important to have the backing of the schools. So even though it's the summer holidays and teachers had one hell of a summer term and were working completely flat out through Easter holidays and May half term, and the majority of the schools that we're working with are still talking to us, even if it's a quick chat from their back garden, to develop the plans and make sure that what we're working with them on is ready for the summer term. And sometimes that involves recruiting volunteers from the school community or site staff in some of the bigger schools to work to implement those kinds of things. I would say that the biggest worry for me in terms of school streets is the idea that we will land up with school streets across the UK that are what I would describe as signs only, which are literally just putting up some signs that says this is a school street between these times, with no kind of enforcement, no physical changes to the street environment. And I kind of think those are, without any supporting activities, are destined to be unsuccessful. So it's really important that, as I say, they're done in sort of small number and done thoroughly. And we can't do the pre-consultation engagement like we normally would, but you can still do a lot of awareness raising so that residents know what's coming to their streets, so that parents know what to expect when they arrive on the first few days of term, and all those kind of things. Again, requires working with local resident associations, the schools, but it's really worth doing that in that kind of really in-depth process, because it results in much more successful schemes and ultimately less problems down the line.
Which is always really valuable. I've got a question that's come in about, and I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. That is, can the panel advise on the toolkits, guides and advice that's available? So I'll start with 3 bits of advice that I know about. One of them, of course, is the new local transport note 120 on cycle infrastructure design. I would encourage you all to have a look at it. It's got some pretty revolutionary stuff in it. I know because I managed its production. And sitting alongside that, of course, is Gear Change, which is the government's new policy document. I keep having to lift my jaw off the table. I'm amazed at what's in there. It's fantastic if we can do that. Dylan O'Reilly, who was going to chair this instead of me, has highlighted a couple of toolkits that London Borough of Hackney are doing. And she says, Hackney is running a school streets hotline every Monday from now until the end of September. And the free service provides local authorities with tailored one-to-one support, as well as up-to-the-minute site-specific advice from Hackney, who've got years of experience. So that sounds fantastic for local authority people to take up and use. And this is a brand new announcement from Hackney. I'm sure she won't mind me passing on to you, because I haven't publicly announced it yet, is that Hackney is providing templates of its school streets design material free of charge for other local authorities to use. So I'm sure that would be really helpful for local authorities trying to put the physical measures for school streets into place. And Fiona, I'm sure there's plenty of advice and designs that you developed along the way. So now I've given you 2 minutes to think about it. Are there any, as Fiona Penny asked, are there any templates that you would like to share that we can use to capture the local insight, map for data, etc.? I'm aware of 1 or 2, maybe commonplace is one of them. Any other thoughts from anyone else?
Yeah, that can be a useful tool. I would say that, I mean, the original Hackney school streets, they have a toolkit, and although it's aimed at permanent school streets, not the COVID-19 emergency, a lot of the principles and foundation in that is still really valid. So I would definitely point anyone towards that. It's been invaluable. They, as you said, they have kind of been blazing the trail for a long time. So I definitely recommend anyone to look at the Hackney School Streets Toolkit. It's and they have on their web pages, they have case studies of the schools that they have done them in, which explain some of the details and how they are different across different sites. I would also, even to anybody that's not in London, Transport for London produced a set of guidance in, I think it was published in June, that was specifically about temporary school streets. Now, a little bit of that will only apply to London, but a lot of it will be very applicable to local authorities across the UK. So I would have a look on, it's on TfL's Street Space page, and it's a specific document about temporary school streets and how to make them work in a temporary situation.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
We have a series of local groups across the UK. They're sort of campaign groups, and they work on specific campaigns to their local areas, so specific street improvements. and they have created a bit of a guide for low traffic neighbourhoods, which is available on our website. And it's not so much for local authorities, but we have a number of toolkits on living streets specifically for families and parents around travel to school, the walk to school, why it's so important, which could be useful in terms of encouraging others to think about walking to school or travelling actively to school as well.
We'll come back perhaps to school streets in a second, but there's a question for Liz here, which I'm going to put to Liz in the first place. Put you on the spot here, Liz, and perhaps you could answer a bit of this, and maybe other people can help as well. The question comes from Giselle Dutoit, and it says, how can active travel and staggered start and finish times be compatible for those with 2 or more young children? Our school now has a 40-minute gap between the earliest and latest end times. Any thoughts as to how that can be addressed?
These are very challenging questions, and yes, I think a lot of it will come down to liaison between schools and planning authorities. It might be that you could see, you could say that these 2 children are in are clearly in a family, therefore they are a bubble. And can they be associated with other bubbles? But I think from the school perspective, they'll say we've got to do year groups. We could be mixing up all the year groups. It very quickly. Some of the ideas around how COVID-19 things will be implemented struggle to be practical, honestly. As a software supplier, we look to support the evidence of that as much as we can, or at least evidence how feasible and workable things are. But on a personal level, as a parent who's got 2 young children, to try and get them into school at different times, that's very difficult. I don't have an easy answer to that one, I'm afraid.
But I think the communication has got to be a starting point, isn't it? Adrian, is that an issue that you're encountering with your SEND work?
Definitely, and I guess to support Liz, we've tried using queue routes in that because it's quite easy to sort of manipulate start and finishing times for different cohorts. But the simple answer is that it's just not practical, as well as the additional vehicles that you might need, the additional costs that local authorities aren't able to spend at the moment, but the practicalities of being able to achieve that are to the extent that many councils will just say, for school transport, we cannot support that, and we will only be able to provide transport for one set time in the afternoon and one set time in the morning, because we don't have the operators and vehicles and drivers in place to be able to support anything different. Because some of the journey times that some of our students have to travel, especially for SEN, are up to near an hour and a half each way. So a lot of the operators, they can't double run these routes. And as Liz says, it's about sort of communicating quite early what is and isn't possible to the schools, because the schools are obviously under pressure to sort of do these staggered times, but it's just not possible in some occasions. And then it's just making sure that the parents are aware of that, and the schools will have to come to a compromise.
Thank you both for that. James Harkins has asked a couple of questions about air pollution, pointing out, of course, that however good your routing is, if you're going to have routing of vehicles at all, you're generating fine particulates, etc. Clearly, a sort of software you're talking about, Liz, is designed to absolutely minimise that, and so are the school streets. Tanya, his first question was actually directed to you. And what is the safe level you're using for fine particulates? Is that something you are able to talk to?
I don't actually know off the top of my head, but I can find that out and send that across. It's the World Health Organization's policy.
Thank you. There were certainly some very interesting results from, I think it was the Waltham Forest in the webinar this morning, showing how low traffic neighbourhoods had dramatically reduced the number of households. I think it was from 70,000 above legal limits to 6,000 above legal limits. He said 6,000 is still too many, but it's a dramatic improvement.
There's sorry, on quickly on that point. The challenge of the fleet and the vehicles that are using it is an ongoing one. And wouldn't it be lovely if we could switch them all off and move to something clean tomorrow? But that's not practical or realistic. There has to be a transition period, and even some discussion about what vehicles are transition to. But the one of our customers was using our software to actually do some what-if planning that then enabled them to start liaising with operators and saying, actually, these are the kind of vehicles that we want to see in the market, so that when they're procuring new vehicles, they can make sure they're getting the right sets. So there's not an easy answer. It's a huge problem, but one that we would like to think that we're contributing to a solution by helping evidence the best vehicles that should be bringing into the market for minimising all that.
And that evidencing goes back to communication, doesn't it? Early communication. That's right. That say what we're going to be expecting, that you can plan for it. That's really valuable. So folks, we've got about 9 more minutes maximum of this webinar before we're going to wrap it up. So if you do have any more questions, please do submit them in the questions box, and I see 1 or 2 coming in. So a slightly provocative one here from, if I can find it, and it was about yes, secondary schools. One secondary school in Farnham apparently has banned cycling to school when students return in September until further notice. This is because they only have one cycle park, and so they claim that year group bubbles cannot be kept separate, despite staggered start and finish times. Any recommendations on how to approach this and persuade them to come up with a way around it? That's from Amanda Muir of Farnham Cycling Campaign. Any thoughts on that other than a lot more bike shelters?
I was just going to say, go buy some bike stands and split them up across the car park.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence of temporary bike stands being set up, but I appreciate some schools are often working with quite restricted space. But that does seem, I don't know, draconian. It seems a confusing choice.
I wonder if it's coming back to timing of things.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to see some more questions. Andrew Casson suggested that regular end-of-day cleaning regimes for cycle racks would be a good idea. There's a follow-up, this is for anyone to answer, from Matthew Hassel, the follow-up question regarding staggered start times. Why are these not possible? If the prize is lower pollution and we're able to remove traffic from the rush hour, then should we not be thinking radically and out of the box to achieve this? Do we need 3 terms, for instance?
Yeah, it's not that it's not possible. It's that I mean, not possible is a very absolute answer. It's not always possible. Because of the implications that has on the way schools are run, and the length of the journeys of the vehicles. So you have to start the vehicle, it has to do its runs and pick up, then it has to go back and start all over again and get back. That's potentially, an hour and a half addition. So that's on either side of the school day. It's beginning to extend the school day. That has implications for staffing. Again, it's a case-by-case basis, and another planner that we're speaking to said actually schools are now becoming very where there were breakfast clubs and there was, you could drop off from 8 o'clock and what have you. Actually, they're narrowing that, and they're saying everybody can't arrive, nobody can arrive before 8:25, and everyone has to be here by 8:40. So actually, rather than extending the arrival window, it's actually narrowing, which promises to make congestion much worse. So again, it comes back to what you were saying a second ago, Martin, about communication and understanding the implications of these things, and then to some extent taking a what's possible approach to it. But
I know certainly with a couple of schools. Sorry, Liz. I know certainly a few schools that we've been working with had initially, and certainly when they were operating pre-summer holidays, they were operating some fairly, not dramatic staggers, but there was good sort of 10 minutes between key stages. But actually quite a lot of them in their planning for September are reducing that back down, particularly because of those problems about parents who have kids in 3 different year groups having to spend 45 minutes or up to an hour, even if they live literally around the corner from a primary school. By the time they pick one up, and then they have to wait for the next year group and then the next year group. And so the feedback they've had is it's just not practical for people to do that. So actually they are keeping a stagger but making it much smaller. So it's only, I think, 5 minutes per key stage. So the stagger time is only 15 minutes. And it helps spread people out a little bit, but it certainly doesn't have too much of an impact on people.
Families, yeah.
Thanks, Fiona. Fiona, I'm going to ask you to keep going. One of the problems, Violet Rook has asked this question. One of the problems is parking in all areas. In some school areas, parking of residents is present too in urban areas. I wonder if you could talk about the issues you've encountered with implementing school streets in terms of particularly residents parking. Is that usually an issue?
Yeah, normally. I think that's fair to say. It's definitely, I mean, in anything, it's always the number one thing that that comes up in the work we do is residents being protective of the street outside their properties. It's worth remembering that they don't own the street outside the properties. It is property of the Highway Authority, but it's what we all forget a lot of the time. And gradually changing that mindset is not something we can do in the next 6 weeks or whatever we've got. So I think, again, this comes down to each of the schools. A lot of schools do have pinch points or narrowing or one-ways outside the school already, and particularly if it's narrowing between parking spaces, there's already been some parking loss. The majority of the schemes we work on, we are pushed to minimise parking loss. That's still the status quo for even the most progressive local authorities we work with. Most will tolerate a few spaces, and particularly if you're clear about what this comes back to what I said about being really clear about what the objectives of your scheme are. If it's about child safety and reduction in road danger, private parking doesn't win in that. Child's road safety generally takes priority over all objectives. So if it needs to remove a couple of parking spaces from on-street parking, even in really congested urban areas, that is generally tolerated, and I would say again that's why it's worth getting those local councillors on board beforehand. Make sure you're talking to the really local, like ward councillors for the area, to make sure they understand what the issues are and what you're trying to address, and that they know that there are compromises, and that maybe losing a couple of parking spaces is what's required. So it's definitely a difficult thing, but I think we shouldn't shy away from it. We should be honest about it, but like I say, be really clear about why we're doing certain things, and that, yeah, I think child road safety generally trumps virtually anything else. So.
Thank you. And one very last question, we've got about a minute to answer it. So Fiona, you mentioned school streets with signs only would not be an ideal, and I agree. It says Lindy Lou or Low. What supporting measures do you propose? Schools I've spoken to are struggling to find staff to manage barriers, given they need all hands on deck, and parent-resident volunteers are unlikely to be sustainable in the long term or when winter sets in. Are there any measures that the schools could use that avoid using so many people?
I would say in the short term, they generally, those kind of barriers and things do require staffing. We're getting different messages from different local authorities and from different schools within a local authority area. Some local authorities are not up for volunteers at all. Others are leaving it down to the schools to decide whether it's whether they recruit a couple of keen parents or whether they use a couple of their site management staff. It very much depends on the size of the school and the relationships they have with their parents and local communities. It's not that long ago that we used to have lollipop people helping us with school crossings. And it's not unthinkable that some people would volunteer to help on a short-term basis. Agreed though on the long-term strategy, it's unlikely to be sustainable for more than a term or two, I'd say. That comes back to the being ambitious and really making sure that it's not just on streets, there is some kind of enforcement. I've mentioned we're very spoilt in London that we can use ANPR camera enforcement. And in the rest of the country, I'd say you really need to be looking at point closures, mini low traffic neighbourhoods, low emission zones around the school.
So there's some complementary styles of measure. Thank
you.
One
ways, all those kind of things. It can be anything, but.
Thank you. So we're already going 1 minute over time. Apologies for that. I'd like to say thank you to all our speakers, to Fiona Blackley from South Strands. Thank you to Adrian Weissenbrook from Wiltshire County Council, to Tanya Braun from Living Streets, and to Liz Davidson, of course, and to Q Roots for sponsoring this event.
Thank you all.
Behind the scenes, you may have heard Juliana O'Rourke from Landor. Thank you, Landor, for facilitating this whole webinar and for making it all happen. And Mark, we haven't heard a word from you, but you've made it all run smoothly. So thank you all very much. And I believe the recordings will be made available to participants afterwards. But I think that's where we end it. Thank you all for attending and taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.